Om 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 Ganganapate Namaha, Gangarabhya Namaha, Om Aim Saraswatyaya Namaha, Om Ganana Antva Ganapatigam Bhavamahe, Kavim Kavinam Upamashavastamam Jyeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspata Anashranvanoti Bisida Sadhanam, Om Shri Mahaganapataye Namaha, Om Namah Shivaya. So, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Shivananda, Om Namo Bhagavate Vishnudevananda. Welcome everyone to this lovely little talk that Sita organized for all of us, which is called Nurturing Good Habits, Nurturing Strong Habits, Nurturing Long-Lasting Habits. So, I would talk a little bit about from the spiritual perspective. There are lots of good books you can find on habits building, step 1, step 2, step 3, and all that. And as I said, there are lots of nice books about how to work with habits, but I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we need to know from a spiritual point of view about the habits. Now, I'm very delightful to see all of you. And as you know, I haven't spoken for a while. None of us have spoken for a while. And it's time to reconnect, rejoin. And I think discussing the habits is always an important subject for anyone and every one of us, because really habits rule our lives. Right. And the habits rule our lives to such a degree that in spite of many of us having some kind of an academic background and knowledge or skills like that, we still know very little about the mind. And also we still know very little how to govern it, how to control it when it's necessary, and certainly how to build the good habits and how to remove the negative ones, right? So I would say they were a work in progress, but if you feel like that there's some good points here tonight, you please write them down. And if you would like to improve something within you, please try to do it as early as tonight or as early as tomorrow morning. You know, apply something that you think, oh, this is okay, what's been said here, so let me see if I can start to work on it. In a simple, there's a simple way we can say that we're quite organized about our external life. We tend to know where our things are most of the time. We have a good shopping list. We have a good, financial side organized. We have our reports in every possible kind of area or realm of life. But in reality, when it comes to our inner world, we find that our minds, our inner world, are in a perpetual turmoil, and there's a very little organization there. And partly because it is obviously more subtle, it is more difficult to manage one's thoughts and feelings. And partly we do not work only with our conscious mind, we work with a very large mind. So sometimes it takes a whole life of practice and dedication to understand one's mind even a little bit. So we must have a humility when it comes to working with our minds, but we also have to have a dedication to and to have a program of some kind, so that whatever changes we want to make in our life, we can do them in a steady way. We can do them in an accountable way, so that we can actually write reports about how far we managed to progress, right? So that's what I'm adding to your already existent hundreds of lists that you have. One is, as Sita has been teaching lovely this group, that is the spiritual diary is a must. Without the spiritual diary, you will find that you will be at least oscillating. And often people who don't keep a record of how they practice and what they do, they don't realize that they're dealing with a much greater force in life than just what they think their mind is. Like we think our mind is just primarily conscious, we're aware of our thoughts, but there is a depth to our mind that is immeasurable, sometimes beset with different problems, traumas, things that are actually uh, they exist like a stumbling blocks in our spiritual life. So we know how difficult at times is to develop a good habit, right? And we also know how easy it is to repeat a bad one. Needless to say, sometimes in spite of your best efforts and you're making your vows day by day, some old habits seems to have an upper hand, and they seem to stick around for ages. For example, like in many of our cases, some junk food is available on and off, because also our values about the junk foods oscillate on and off. Sometimes we think the certain types of foods are bad and we shouldn't be eating them. And another time we value that food as a valuable thing, something that creates a pleasure in our mind and our body. And so we can oscillate like this because our values are not set. In fact, our value for the pleasure is more deeply set than it is as something, for example, that as food is not good for us. So many people over the time have become social media junkies. I don't mean you, but there are lots of people who are really, especially during the COVID, they found refuge in Facebook and other things. And, because we're simply not trained, we have not been educated to be by ourselves or to find any pleasure, in fact, in silence or in self observation or meditation, or anything like that. Or needless to say, some other activities such as singing a kirtan or doing something together, which may be better. So there's no blame for anything. It's just what it is. Sometimes perhaps we try to remove a negative habit, but our method wasn't quite right. Maybe it wasn't quite sufficient also. So the stronger the negative habit, for example, the more like variated angles you have to have, the more perspectives you have to have, and the more tools or weapons you have to have available, right? It's not, our mind is not simple, and the more complicated the war, the enemy, the more important, the more regrouping is necessary and bringing up all our talents out. So this is also what we have to do. The good news is that each one of us has an infinite potential to become, on one hand, whatever we wish, meaning whatever is positive for us and empowering. On another hand, our infinite potential is expressed in the realization of the infinite. So our infinite potential is found in God, or is found in the self, or any way you want to call it. It's our birthright. It's not just something that we should necessarily, think, oh, one day maybe, but not now. No, that is our infinite potential. And I will remind you right now is to, from now onwards, from tonight, not tomorrow, is to not consider your past anymore or your failures as any relevant in your life. Only if you want to, of course, draw on some lesson, you're welcome to think about this for a few minutes, not too long. And whatever may be the past, whatever may be the faults that we have committed, whatever the ignorance that we may exhibited, in which we might have lived, remember that deep within ourselves lies the supreme purity, and that supreme purity is the seed of the supreme realization. We must know to think in this way, because building habits is not just about having a new set of habits. We have to also understand that they should be leading us towards something else. So I guess the first thing I would like to bring up tonight, so now come some little points I hope that will be useful to you. What should our attitude be towards building new positive habits, as well as our spiritual life? Okay, so there's a difference. There's a difference between living your life outside and leading a spiritual life. In fact, I remember myself when I was not involved too much with spirituality. I was leading a normal kind of a life, like everybody else, with normal kinds of problems. The problems were obviously quite large at that time, but a lot of distractions were enabling me to just keep on going without finding any answers. But it was only when I committed to a spiritual life that I had to take into account many things that I never really worried about. For example, how I utilize my time, right? Um, what is the priority? For example, now I could find it very difficult to spend 2-3 hours doing something that is of no use to me, like ultimately. Whereas before, spending 2-3 hours doing something useless, it was okay. It was just part of my life. So it is only when you come to spiritual life that every minute is being measured. You know, maybe you don't feel that even right now, but there comes the time when you feel like, okay, this life is not going to be forever. So let me now think about how I can utilize my time the best. So the first thing we should understand like this, that we cannot have the same attitude towards spiritual life and towards, for example, other forms of learning also. For example, when you're in the school, in university, college or whatever, you know, you're given a set of sciences or, you know, subjects that you have to cover. And our attitude towards these things is such that we study many of these things in the schools, things such as chemistry or grammar or mathematics and everything. So we daily repeat, you know, what we were taught, certain principles, laws, lots of details and everything, but only to one day really after we have assimilated all of that, to realize that we don't need to repeat all of this every day. For example, if you learn certain conjugations of verbs or declensions of nouns in a language, let's say Spanish or something like this, now that you're able to speak it, you don't think, oh, how did this rule go? What's happening there? Or in the field of mathematics or economics or finance or any kind of thing, law, you don't necessarily have to remember which page that law is and everything. You're able to use it, and you're able to, because of that, because of your level of assimilation, you can also let go of it. But in a spiritual life is completely opposite, right? Everything in spiritual life is based on repetition, right? So the habit rules the spiritual life as much as it does, you know, the life outside, even more so. So every day we must go deeper and deeper into the same truths until they become a part and parcel of our being, of who we are, until we're able to truly walk our talk, which is a very big challenge, a very big challenge. So, you know, what you can accomplish in 5 or 6 years of deep study in a university will take many lifetimes to master it in spiritual field. So this is what I'm just saying, that to have the right attitude, to not be, you know, to not feel, you know, maybe challenge that you have to repeat several things or many things and every day. Like you meditate every day. You don't say, okay, I mastered meditation, now I don't need to meditate. Okay, so it's true for also all habits. Now, habits simply mean employing our will and knowing some little principles around it, having an intelligent plan, and knowing basically some principles about how to develop them. But all the building of habits truly depends on the quality and the strength of your willpower. And that is something that we can only develop in time. None of us has come with a tremendous willpower for everything. Maybe we have some willpower in certain areas of life, but not in all. And in spiritual life, this is absolutely necessary. When we think about the word will, often we like to discuss it, theorize about this, but the truth is that the will is only found in action. It can only be expressed in the form of an action, however little that will can be employed and however little that action is. So, you know, like a spiritual life believes, in spiritual life, we believe that any habit that we want to build can be very small in a sense of activity, and yet if it has a consistency, that's all we need, right? So, for example, to succeed in developing any habit, the most important principle is continuity, or you can say regularity. Now, of course, we are living in times when uh, our, our life is very complex, and because of that, we find that we have less and less time to do things that are really important for us because we're caught up in all of the other things. There's an ever draining technology that is adding ever and ever more work and all that. There's, you know, the life has become complex, and the biggest reason why the life is so complex is because there's only one direction that the human mind is actually decided to follow, which is the materialism. It's the believing that only matter is important, that only enjoyments are important, only wealth is important, has actually crippled our spirituality, has crippled our willpower and everything. This is why so many people are having so many negative and bad habits, so many addictions and so many problems, because the spirituality hasn't taken a deep root in our life. It's not part of our education. Usually we come to spirituality only when something has struck us, or some accident or some problem or some unhappiness and everything, which is okay, which is fine. We have all come into it because of that. But again, the willpower was weakened by desire. Desire, when it's transmuted, becomes the will and becomes the building factor of habits. So if you want to build positive habits, you also have to work with this desire system, primarily working with desires that are unnecessary and perhaps not so important, and see if you can replace them with some more positive desires, such as helping other people, making time for other people, making, giving energy to other people, all of that. So the first principle is the continuity. Somebody said very lovely, I think some gentleman by name Albert Hubbard, he says the genius is often only the power of making continuous efforts. And you find that the people who make continuous effort, they may not be successful always, but that is the part of the genius. That's part of the eventually they will succeed, even though they don't have necessarily a bigger success right now or anything like that. And with building the habits, the beginning is always the hardest part. And as I said, in this time of an overload of, you know, work and technology and all that information, in fact, I think we're living in a world of information so deeply that we're not able to kind of extricate our willpower to utilize it in other ways, but we will. So what we should try to avoid when working with will is to try to avoid disconnected attempts, meaning irregular attempts, spasmodic efforts. Yeah, something that lacks focus and the strength and the weight. This is also true for relationships. You know, a lot of people, especially here, we find in the West, you know, our relationships are like, they last like this for a second and then nothing. You know, somebody says, oh, you're so wonderful, I really want to keep a contact with you, and then you find them and you don't find them. You know, then they all go somewhere else. So also this, the problem with the willpower is because it's this challenge of being pulled in so many different directions. So here's a principle: whether in your daytime or whether in your interest area, try to avoid doing or being committed to too many things at once. It would deplete your energy. No one is large enough to split themselves into many pieces, right? Many parts. So the energy, which is an important aspect of the will, must be conserved. And this is what you find in a very wonderful, mature people, and certainly in mature yogis. that they know how to manage their energies and their time and everything. All of that is interconnected. The next principle is, even though we have negative habits, many negative habits, I will address a little bit of that subject, but you try to first concentrate, try to actually concentrate exclusively on positive, on what you want, right? And forget as entirely as possible what you don't want to be. It reminds me in this sense, Teresa of some place, I can remember, in France, who said, you know, they ask, do you think of your Lord with all your heart, with all your soul and everything? Do you think all the time? And she says, I do. And then they ask her, well, what about the devil? And she said, I don't have time for it. So this is what she said. When your focus is on really building the positive, you will find that it's kind of easier to work with the negative if they show up. Or of course, sometimes you may have to have a different system for that, but this is the pure psychological law that if we concentrate on the positive, the negative will be less capable of troubling us. So the whole key here is to concentrate on what you try to achieve, and not concentrate or not be concerned with the challenges, difficulties, or hindrances of any kind. I always say, go to Sita now and ask how to keep a spiritual diary. I am totally amazed that that people keep a spiritual diary because either you're doing it, or because you're in the Sita's program. I have to say that I've thought about spiritual diary and self-analysis many times with whatever little knowledge I have, but I have found very few adherents to this subject. And I could talk for an hour why that is the case, but I can also just say in one single sentence that a daily review of what you want to make, to create, and your plan of work will give you tremendous results along the course of your spiritual journey. And I will have to say that certain things have saved me after all these years, because I did keep the spiritual diary, and certain things I did not necessarily do well because I didn't take seriously what my spiritual diary was telling me. But because also sometimes the spiritual diary, which is not coupled with, with some time for self-reflection, it's not exactly quite a complete modality, I would say, of working with the mind. And so what happens with the self-reflection is that we must take some minutes every day and go through our day and ask ourselves, how did we do this? Why did we think about this person in that way? Why did we do that particular thing? Even if it's a habit or negative habit in that particular way, there wasn't an inquiry. And because there was an inquiry, there was nothing to, look through the potential influences that are behind, that make us make decisions that we make. So the problem that I find with self-reflection is simply very often the time, right? It's like I think, oh my God, when I'm going to find time, even if it's 10 minutes in my busy day, just to look at my mind. Whenever you sit down to look at your mind or do something like this, part of your mind, which is obviously materialistically influenced, think, oh my God, but it's not as productive. I'm not doing anything that is productive. I'm just kind of watching my mind, and I'm just kind of, whatever. I'm seeing something and not seeing something. So I say, if possible, do become a part of it, of this little club, the spiritual diary and self-reflection diary club. It will help you a lot if you have the company of other yogis. If you have the help of other people, you find that you're going to be wonderfully moving forward. So each one of us is supposed to know what negative habits we have, what positive habits we would like to build. There should be a list, right? We should know also through the application of the spiritual diary what the extent of our progress is. So we should look at our progress every week, not just once in a while, but every week we look at the previous week. For example, I like to look at my previous year in the same week. Like I look at now, it's March 14th, so I say, okay, what did I do last week around this time? How much of meditation did I do? How much of this did I do? Like that. Quickly, I just put the numbers like that. And you know, sometimes it's really sad that we don't have time for these things. We have time for everything else, right? If you want to be distracted by a sports thing or by a movie, by some kind of a rajas kind of, it's okay. But what happens is that these things require time. And so the first habit I would like to remind you to develop is to try to wake up as early as you can and try to go to sleep as early as you can. Many of you are doing that, I know that. And many of you are probably not doing that because it is a strong habit. Why? Because you're trying to stay as productive to the end of your day as possible, or to provide some quiet and some maybe relaxation time or fun time at the end of your day. But you will find that if you do not create this first habit, that it will be hard to create other habits, especially if you take into account the amount of busyness that we all have. So yeah, you have to gradually learn, even though it's hard, your mind will be crying sometimes, to give up the distractions that often come on the spiritual path. So the time management is a big thing. The energy management is an important thing in here. So what do we need to then think of before we even set up the list of habits is to think of what is our goal, what is our destination. And if you're clear on what our destination is, we will be less distracted, right? So if I know that I'm driving down to Florida and that's where I'm supposed to get by next Friday, I'm not going to be going and seeing Colorado a little bit and then maybe go to Georgia and then a little bit Alabama, listen to some gospel music, rock and roll, this and that. Then, you know, I will be arriving in a month's time. So this is what we need to do. Another important thing in this subject is to figure out the negative habits and then to actually make a vow that we are going to be quick with getting rid of negative habits because we want to as quick as possible, right? It still may take years for some things to go away, but this should be our attitude because we don't know what may come uh, our way. Sometimes it is also good to tackle the biggest negative habit, the most challenging habit first, especially if that is something that compromises your health or your relationships or whatever it is. So that will be the best thing to deal with first. And you know, when you're trying to remove a negative habit or break it, a lot of us go through some kind of an emotional pain in the beginning. Like, for example, if you try not to eat sweets or not to try to eat cheese crackers or something, you know, the first day is very difficult. You think, oh my God, I'm going to die simply just from not having this. Don't worry about dying from having it, but not having it is what causes the problem, right? So then you feel like, you know, something is dying in you when you cannot have your little drug in a form of something that you like, coffee, this and that. And these are things that are relatively easy to actually deal with, but nevertheless, for some of us can be still a challenge. So remember that the mind, for most of it, is simply a bundle of habits. It's not more than that for most of it, right? So the best time for forming habits is youth, right? So if you were lucky enough to have your parents who were a little bit more military and sweet on the other side, kind on one hand and military another way, you would have built some good habits. Hopefully, I'm not saying military in a negative way. I just think those people who were like, you know, the mothers and fathers who were firmer with us. And what you find in yourself, the most consistent, it is something really that was built at a time when you were very young and when you were growing up. So what happens is the older you get, the more difficult it is to change habits, right? Because you're set. You're set in meaning you have a self-identity that is set. You think, okay, well, this is who I am. I'll try change this a little bit, change that. You're like you're doubling, as they say. You're like just you don't really want to get rid of a bad habit. And the problem with getting rid of a bad habit is that you can't really get rid of the bad habit that you don't want to get rid of. So this is you have to be clear in your mind whether you really want that habit to go or not. And of course, then the war will be there. The lover mind will be coming. You say, well, for a long time the bad habits were making your life so interesting and pleasurable, and now you want to kick us out, and we don't agree with that, so we're going to put up the resistance and we're going to fight you. That's what normally happens, right? So here the principle is that don't change too many habits at a time, one habit at a time. So let's say you want to just go to sleep earlier, you want to wake up earlier. So sometimes you fail, it doesn't really matter, but this is what you're trying to do. Any habits that you developed when you were young will stick to you when you're older. Remember that. Nevertheless, some of us are not as young anymore as we used to be, right? But it's okay. Many of the habits also were built because we did not know what to do with ourselves. Either we were bored, we were depressed, or we were simply restless and we didn't know how to relax. So many people who develop the habits such as smoking or drinking or something like this, they do it exactly when they feel psychologically this way. They're not maybe governed by some deep trauma or some problem from their past or anything like this. They're just, they built these habits when they didn't know what to do with their own self. They wanted a little pleasure, a little distraction and everything. So when people obviously want to have some relief from their work or their stress, this is what they do. They resort exactly to those negative habits. So Swami Shivananda, as you heard Sita saying, if you saw a thought, you will reap an action. If you saw an action, you reap a tendency. If you saw a tendency, you reap a habit. If you saw a habit, you create a certain character. And if you saw a character, you reap a destiny. If you go backwards, this is a good teaching for everybody. If you have friends or people that you would like to share something with spiritual, but it's not frightening, you're not using the words God, you're not using the word anything like that, you can use this sentence. I think it's very beautiful. Coming back from the destiny is really that which is simply formed out of your character in many different ways. Your character is formed from different habits. And so when you go back from destiny to character to habits to tendencies to thoughts, you realize that the thought is the earliest and the easiest way to change something. But as you go further down the line, it becomes more difficult. This is why we also have a problem changing our habits, because they're way down the line. Each thought that we have, it produces an impression in the subconscious mind called samskara. And that samskara kind of sinks down after some time. And then the similar samskara, similar impressions of similar actions coalesce together, creating a more formidable force. So you're dealing with lots of interesting things. But let's put it this way. You want to become a self-reliant person. You want to build a new life, new destiny. How do you begin? You begin by changing your thoughts. Every day you train to think in a different way about something that you want to change. So we know that, for example, if you want to change a habit of eating something, you have a certain value about this. Now, when I use the word value, this is quite a heavy value. Let's say I like, I like alcohol, let's say. So that I like the alcohol because the alcohol represents the value of many different things. One, it's relaxing. One, it's the whatever else it does. All the good things that I know about alcohol are the part of the value. Now, I come to a point, either the doctor told me if I continue to drink, I'm not going to, live long or whatever. So now I'm confused a little bit. I need to set a new value. And of course, I'm trying to set the value based on fear, which is not really quite sustainable, but it is a good step forward. So what I have to do is to learn to think in a different way. Now, this is where the important practice comes, is to kind of loosen up the old way of thinking about something that became bad habits, and to introduce a new ways of thinking about the same things, right? So now I'm trying to give the value to alcohol that was not there before. And we will come to it in a minute, but I think this is just an idea. So the first thing I would say, this is one of the big habits I had, is that as I was growing up, I always thought that, my parents were responsible for everything, right? So there was this blame. Now, the first, I'd say, habit when you enter into these other habits is to try to cultivate not blaming others for what you experience, for your circumstances. And remember, you are the one that creates your destiny. You're the one that molds it every day. And eventually you become the one who is the master of destiny, right? So you're the helm of the ship, as they say, of your life. The helm of the ship is in your hands. And nobody else can achieve those wonderful things for you but yourself. As my teacher used to say, do not depend on anybody, right? If you want to develop a good habit of something, don't depend on anybody. Don't think, oh, if that person changes, then I will change. If that person practices, I will practice. If my husband practices compassion, I will practice compassion. If my child is, don't do that. That will be your giving your helm of the ship to somebody else's hands, right? So this is important, that not nobody can do things for us, but also nobody else can stand in our way of achieving good things. Also, there's nobody else, only perhaps sometimes our negative attitude, but even in itself, it's a problem. So we all suffer from this impulse. It's almost an impulse to try to immediately blame somebody else if we are undergoing some difficulty or challenge in our life, right? I'm not saying blame yourself either. That's not the point. I'm just saying that we have to learn to understand, okay, this is the result of whatever I have put input in my life and everything. Let it be. So now I'm going to deal with that. So this impulse to throw the blame on circumstances is truly a trick of the mind. And it's, Swami Shivananda says, it's a weapon of Maya. Maya means illusory power. So now something practical a little bit, because sometimes I tend to talk introductory things for a very long time and not really get to the point, but hopefully I will get to the point. There are people who they have a gigantic will. They do really, and they achieve the things by just the mere sankalpa, just the pure intention. And this is very rare to find, but there are people, for example, who have such a tremendous willpower that if they decide that they don't want something, they just don't do it, you know? So they basically, what they will do, they cut at the very root of a negative habit, and they say, that's it. At one stroke, the habit is gone. And this is the best method. Why? Because for two reasons. One is that you tend to get over that negative habit anyway. And at the same time, you contribute, you build your willpower to such an extent that it actually accelerates your journey towards the end goal of your life, meaning spiritual realization. However, we know that this is not easy for everybody. I mean, as they say in the scriptures, nothing succeeds like success. And there's no easier way of giving up a bad habit than giving it up. However, in real life, that we might find that it's not as easy as it may sound. So some people, may have to take some more time. They're not strong, and this is kind of most of us. You see, some people may give up smoking or drinking and everything, and they will be brooding over it. They will be craving for it. They will be thinking about this. They will be talking about this. But there's a better method for it. The method for people who don't have a gigantic wheel is a kind of a gradual method. And this will be, this is Swami Shivananda's teaching. So what we would do, you write down on a piece of paper what you wish to give up. And that should be in a form of a prayer, right? So on that piece of paper, you should also state down what the consequences or problems you see arising from continuing with that negative habit. For example, if it's smoking, what it can cause problems with lungs and the cancer and circulation, all kinds of things. If it's a problem with something else, you just write it down. Then what you need to do is you read this piece of paper every morning as you wake up, the moment you wake up, and also every evening before you go to sleep. Then what you do, you think about it a little bit. You can't just read it, okay? You read it out loud. Then you, as you think about this, you kind of let this idea roll in your mind again and again for a little while, and let them sink deeper and deeper. And then let the conviction in your mind be so strong, let it grow, that you come to this conclusion: this habit should be given up. I want to give up this habit. And now you have to raise an intention in your mind, which is called sankalpa, and you say, I will give up this habit from now on. And you do it. You go offer a prayer to the Lord to help you give up a prayer. There's all kinds of things you can do. But what's going to happen, even if you're not able to give up that negative habit, you will find this when you actually indulge in it, that you will begin to experience first a decreased level of pleasure coming from that thing. Why? Because there will be some guilt that will be coming, and it will bother you. Now you're conflicted, and that conflict is the first step out of that negative habit, right? So that's okay. It's just a part of it. Then eventually you will start to become a little more detached, and eventually you're going to feel repulsion from it. And this is how it goes. The habit will drop away. You have to take as much time as it needs to. Sometimes you may need to discuss it with other people and all that. But the most important part of this, when you write it on a piece of paper and you write the consequences, the challenges of it, that you should be regular in your morning and evening reflection time over that particular habit. Okay, because if that's not there, it will drift away. You know, that habit will continue to hold sway over you. This is kind of how it is. Another important thing is, do not try to fight the habits, because habits generally take hold of our personality because our will is already weak. So if you fight the habit in a kind of a head-on direct way, you will only lose with your already weakened willpower, right? So that we should try not to get in, worried about too much, because even if you fail, you have to not worry, but again, use your discriminative power, your reflection time, sit down calmly and analyze again and again, and bring up the sankalpa, the decision, the intention again and again, to give it up indefinitely or entirely. At the same time, you must be involved in some positive activities, right? So you have to continue with your spiritual practices, meditation. Let's say you are singing with people, kirtan, or you're doing, all of that is extremely important. You have to have a spiritual support in building your habits, which are going to be there for you, so that your mind doesn't kind of venture in a direction of all those things you really want to give up. You can do that, and then slowly you will become a changed person. So this is kind of what I would suggest. Now, There's a lot more to be said about the process of building habits and eradication habits, but we're already coming to an hour, so I'm going to stop here for a moment, and we'll see if there are any questions or any answers, and maybe we have to have a part 2 to this. We'll see. Om, om, om.